"You're not my husband, don't question me," she said when I asked about her late nights. I'd walked through our front door after a 12-hour shift maintaining the regional power grid, still wearing my safety gear and steel-toed boots, expecting to find my wife Grace home for dinner like we'd planned. Instead, I found her getting ready to leave again, applying makeup with the precision of someone preparing for something important. I'd been watching this pattern develop for weeks now, the mysterious phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room, the new friends she mentioned but never introduced me to, the sudden interest in going out on weeknights when she'd always preferred staying home. When I asked where she was heading at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday, she turned from the mirror with an expression I'd never seen before, cold and dismissive. I wasn't questioning her right to have a social life. I was trying to understand why my wife of 4 years was treating me like a stranger in our own home. Her response cut through any remaining illusions I had about where our marriage stood. I looked at her for a long moment, processing those words that seemed designed to wound, then nodded slowly. "You're absolutely right," I said, pulling out my phone to call my buddy Dexter. I'd already secured the downtown apartment 3 days earlier. After the 4th consecutive night she'd come home after midnight with explanations that grew thinner each time. The moving truck was scheduled for tomorrow morning, something I'd arranged during my lunch break while sitting in my work van, finally accepting what I'd been trying to deny for months. Grace stopped applying her lipstick, probably expecting me to fight for our marriage, to beg her to reconsider, to promise I'd give her more space or freedom or whatever she thought she needed. Instead, I went to our bedroom and pulled out the suitcases I'd hidden in the back of our closet, methodically packing my clothes while she stood in the doorway looking genuinely shocked. I wasn't angry. Anger would have meant I still had emotional investment in whatever game she thought we were playing. I was simply done with being made to feel like an inconvenience in my own life. My years as a power grid technician had taught me to recognize when a system was failing beyond repair, when continuing to patch problems only delayed the inevitable breakdown. Grace's attitude toward our marriage had been deteriorating for months, but tonight she'd finally said what she'd been thinking all along. I wasn't her husband in any meaningful sense, just someone who paid half the mortgage and occasionally got in the way of her real priorities. I folded my work uniforms with the same systematic approach I used when troubleshooting electrical problems, each item finding its designated place while Grace watched from the hallway. She tried several different approaches over the next hour, confusion about why I was overreacting, anger that I was being dramatic, even a brief attempt at seduction that felt more insulting than appealing. None of it worked because I'd already emotionally disconnected from the situation weeks ago, the night she'd laughed when I mentioned wanting to plan our 5th anniversary. The moving process revealed how little we'd actually built together during our 4 years of marriage. My tools and workshop equipment filled 3 boxes. My engineering books from college took up another, my furniture from my bachelor days that Grace had reluctantly allowed me to keep, while most of the decorative items and shared purchases belonged to her or meant nothing to me. Every piece I packed told the story of how I'd gradually made myself smaller in this relationship, storing my hobbies in the garage, keeping my work stories to myself because she found them boring, apologizing for taking up space with my interests. By 11 p.m., I'd packed everything that truly mattered, leaving behind the king-sized bed we'd bought together, the expensive coffee maker she'd insisted we needed, the artwork she'd chosen that never reflected my taste. Grace had given up trying to talk to me and left for whatever mysterious appointment she'd been preparing for, probably figuring she'd deal with my tantrum when she got home. I heard her car pull out of the driveway with that aggressive acceleration she used when she was frustrated, likely heading to meet whoever had become more important than her marriage. I spent the night on the couch in our living room for the last time, not because I was sad but because my new apartment wouldn't be available until morning and I wanted to be present when the movers arrived. The house felt different already, like a hotel room I'd checked out of mentally even though my body was still there. I woke up at 6 a.m. to the sound of a rideshare vehicle pulling into our driveway, followed by Grace's key in the front door. She looked disheveled and surprised to find me awake, clearly having hoped to slip in unnoticed and continue pretending nothing had changed. Her hair was messed up in a way that suggested she hadn't been home all night, and she was wearing the same dress from yesterday but somehow it looked wrinkled and hastily put back on. The moving truck arrived 15 minutes later, right on schedule, and I watched her face transform from confusion to genuine panic as she realized I wasn't bluffing about leaving. Two professional movers efficiently loaded my belongings while Grace stood on our front porch in yesterday's clothes, watching her husband of 4 years disappear from her life with the same methodical precision I brought to my electrical work. She kept trying to catch my eye, probably hoping for some sign that this was all an elaborate attempt to get her attention, but I was focused on checking items off my moving list and making sure nothing got left behind. The irony wasn't lost on me that after years of feeling invisible in my own marriage, she was finally seeing me clearly now that I was leaving. She tried one last time to engage me in conversation, asking if we could talk about this like adults, but I was already mentally calculating the drive time to my new place and wondering whether I'd have time to set up my workshop before my next shift. The last thing I saw in my rearview mirror was Grace standing alone in front of a house that would soon be entirely hers to manage, finally getting the independence she'd been demanding without realizing what she was actually giving up. My downtown apartment felt like stepping into a different version of my life, one where I could actually spread out and exist without constantly calculating whether I was taking up too much space. The place came furnished with basic pieces, but I'd brought my essential tools and within the first week had started setting up a proper workshop in the spare bedroom. Dexter came by the second night with pizza and beer, looking around the space with obvious approval. I distanced myself from him during my marriage because Grace found his humor inappropriate and his weekend motorcycle rides childish, but reconnecting with my college roommate reminded me how much I'd missed having someone who actually got my sense of humor. He helped me arrange my workbench and organize my tools while we caught up on the 3 years of friendship I'd basically put on hold to keep the peace at home. The freedom to have a friend over without checking with anyone first felt almost surreal after years of running social plans past Grace like a teenager asking permission. Within days, I'd established a routine that revolved entirely around my own preferences: coffee at 6 a.m. while reading actual news instead of Grace's social media drama, work shifts that I no longer had to justify or apologize for, evenings spent either working on furniture projects or just sitting in complete silence if that's what I wanted. I'd forgotten how much I enjoyed working with my hands, creating something functional and beautiful from raw materials. The meditative process of sanding and finishing wood until it was exactly right. During my marriage, my workshop had been relegated to a corner of the garage where I had to move Grace's car and various storage boxes just to access my tools, making every project feel like an imposition rather than a pleasure. Now I had proper lighting, ventilation, and enough space to work on multiple pieces simultaneously. Meanwhile, Grace had begun her social media campaign about our temporary separation, posting carefully crafted messages about needing space to grow and find herself, accompanied by photos of her looking contemplative and strong. She was clearly expecting me to respond publicly, to engage in some kind of online dialogue about our relationship status, but I deleted most social media apps from my phone years ago and wasn't about to start performing our private business for an audience. Her increasingly frantic calls and texts revealed that my silence was not part of whatever script she'd been following in her head. She'd apparently expected me to spend these weeks begging for reconciliation, proving how much I needed her, making grand gestures to win her back. Instead, I was learning how to cook for one person, exploring neighborhoods I'd never had time to visit when I was constantly managing her emotional needs, and sleeping better than I had in months. Her messages shifted from confident declarations about taking time apart to confused questions about whether I was planning to come home, then to barely concealed panic when she realized I'd actually moved my workshop equipment and wasn't just staying somewhere temporarily to make a point. The change in her tone was almost fascinating to observe. She'd gone from treating our separation as a strategic move designed to make me more grateful and attentive to genuine shock that I'd taken her demand for independence at face value. Dexter found the whole situation hilarious and kept encouraging me to block her number entirely, but I was curious to see how long it would take her to realize I wasn't playing the game she thought we were in. Her texts became increasingly desperate as days turned into weeks, asking why I wasn't fighting for our marriage, demanding to know if I'd ever actually loved her, accusing me of being cold and emotionless. The irony was that I'd spent years fighting for our marriage by making myself smaller, quieter, less demanding, constantly accommodating her changing moods and priorities until I'd basically disappeared as an individual. Now that I'd stopped fighting and started living, she was finally noticing my absence, but only because it threatened her sense of control over the situation. I'd respond to her practical questions about mail forwarding and insurance coverage, but ignored the emotional manipulation and demands for explanations I didn't owe her. The pottery class was Dexter's idea, suggested during one of our Thursday night dinners when I mentioned having too much free time in the evenings. He'd found the community center listing online and insisted that learning a new skill would be better for my mental health than spending every night in my workshop, though I suspected he was mainly trying to get me out of the apartment and around other people. The instructor was a patient older woman named Helen who treated our beginner attempts at centering clay with the same seriousness she'd probably give to advanced techniques, and the other students were a mix of retirees, young professionals, and creative types looking for a meditative hobby. I was drawn to the methodical process, the way you had to maintain steady pressure and focus to keep the clay from collapsing, the satisfaction of creating something functional from shapeless material. The rhythm of the wheel and the need for complete concentration reminded me of the precision required in electrical work, where one moment of inattention could cause serious problems. During the third class, I noticed Iris working at the wheel next to mine, completely absorbed in shaping what looked like the beginning of a bowl, her concentration so complete that she didn't seem aware of anyone else in the room. She had this natural grace with the clay that made my wobbly attempts look clumsy by comparison, but when I complimented her technique, she laughed and mentioned she'd been taking classes for 2 years and still felt like a complete amateur most of the time. Her humility was refreshing after years of living with someone who treated every minor accomplishment like a world-changing achievement worthy of social media documentation. Iris worked as a freelance book editor, which explained her careful attention to detail and the way she approached each project with methodical precision, treating pottery the same way she probably treated manuscript revisions. Our conversations started with comparing techniques and discussing different types of clay, but gradually expanded to books, art, the satisfaction of creating something with your hands after spending most of your day working with abstract concepts. She appreciated craftsmanship in all its forms and was genuinely interested when I mentioned my furniture making, asking thoughtful questions about wood grain and joinery techniques that showed she understood the patience required for quality work. Unlike Grace, who'd always treated my hobbies as time stolen from more important activities like accompanying her to social events or helping her create content for her Instagram feed, Iris seemed to find my dedication to creating functional beauty both admirable and attractive. She talked about editing the same way I thought about woodworking, as a process of taking something rough and shaping it into its best possible form through patience and skill. After a few weeks of working side by side and sharing coffee during the break, I asked if she'd be interested in visiting a local art gallery that was featuring woodworking pieces, and she suggested we make it a proper date by getting dinner afterward. Our first real evening together felt natural and unforced, 2 adults sharing interests and discovering compatibility without drama or games. She chose a restaurant she'd researched specifically for its commitment to local ingredients, the kind of place that reflected actual values rather than just trying to impress people with high prices and complicated presentations. We spent 3 hours talking about everything from her work editing historical fiction to my experience maintaining critical infrastructure, finding common ground in our appreciation for behind-the-scenes work that most people never noticed but made everything else possible. I realized during that dinner how long it had been since I'd had a conversation where I didn't have to carefully monitor my words to avoid triggering someone's mood swings or insecurities. Iris listened when I talked, asked follow-up questions that showed she was actually processing what I said, and shared her own experiences without making everything about her emotional needs or social media presence. The contrast with Grace was so stark that I wondered how I'd convinced myself that constant drama and manipulation were normal parts of a relationship. After dinner, we walked through the arts district looking at gallery windows and street art, and she mentioned that she'd noticed someone following us during the meal but hadn't wanted to interrupt our conversation to point it out. When I asked what she meant, she described a woman who'd been seated alone near the restaurant entrance, watching our table intently while pretending to read her phone, occasionally taking photos that seemed directed toward our table rather than her food. The description matched Grace perfectly, down to the nervous way she twisted her hair when she was anxious or plotting something. I apologized for bringing drama into what should have been a peaceful evening, but Iris handled the revelation with the same calm professionalism she brought to everything else, suggesting we simply be aware of our surroundings for future dates rather than letting someone else's instability control our choices. Over the following weeks, Grace's surveillance became more obvious and desperate. She started showing up at places where she thought I might be, including lurking outside the pottery studio on class nights, sitting in her car across from the community center like some kind of private investigator watching for criminal activity. Helen mentioned that someone had called asking about class schedules and whether a specific tall, dark-haired man was enrolled, which confirmed that Grace was actively tracking my activities rather than just accidentally running into me around town. The behavior was escalating from passive observation to active investigation, which suggested she was becoming increasingly unhinged by my refusal to engage with her emotional manipulation. Iris handled the situation with remarkable grace, never making me feel guilty for bringing chaos into her previously peaceful life, but also never pretending that Grace's behavior was normal or acceptable. She had this way of acknowledging problems without being consumed by them, treating Grace's stalking as an unfortunate reality to manage rather than a crisis that required dramatic responses or constant discussion. Grace's behavior escalated dramatically when she started showing up at my workplace, something that crossed every professional boundary I'd tried to maintain between my personal drama and my career responsibilities. The regional power station where I worked maintained strict security protocols, but she'd apparently convinced the front desk that she was my wife bringing me lunch, using our shared last name and her considerable charm to gain access to the employee break area. My supervisor Marcus pulled me aside after the second incident, explaining that while he sympathized with marital problems, having emotional confrontations in a facility that managed critical infrastructure for half the city wasn't acceptable. She'd cornered my colleague Tony near the equipment bay, asking detailed questions about my schedule, whether I'd mentioned dating anyone new, and demanding to know if my coworkers had noticed changes in my behavior since our separation. The fact that she was essentially interrogating people I had to work with every day made my professional environment feel contaminated by her instability. I had to explain to my entire team that Grace and I were separated and she was not authorized to receive any information about my work schedule or personal life, a conversation that felt both humiliating and necessary for everyone's safety. The situation reached a breaking point during the monthly art fair downtown, where I'd been invited to display 3 furniture pieces I'd completed in my new workshop. It was my first public showing since the separation, and I was genuinely excited to get feedback from potential customers and other craftspeople, finally feeling confident enough in my work to share it publicly. Iris had helped me arrange the display and was handling conversations with interested visitors while I worked on final adjustments to the pieces, creating exactly the kind of supportive partnership I'd never experienced with Grace. The fair was going well until Grace appeared near my booth, initially keeping her distance but gradually moving closer while pretending to browse other vendors. She was dressed inappropriately for the outdoor event, wearing heels and a cocktail dress that suggested she'd planned this appearance as some kind of performance rather than genuine interest in supporting my work. When she finally approached my table, she ignored Iris completely and launched into a loud monologue about how proud she was of my artistic development and how she'd always encouraged my creative pursuits. The lies were so blatant that several people who'd been listening to my actual story about developing woodworking skills after my separation looked genuinely confused by her version of events. She claimed credit for encouraging me to pursue furniture making when she'd actually spent years complaining about the noise, the mess, and the time I spent away from her social events. Iris tried to redirect the conversation toward the actual pieces on display, but Grace escalated her performance, grabbing my arm possessively and announcing to everyone within hearing distance that we were working through some temporary difficulties but our marriage was stronger than ever. The public humiliation was devastating, especially since I'd specifically invited several potential clients and fellow craftspeople who now witnessed what appeared to be a domestic dispute at what should have been a professional event. I had to choose between making a scene by correcting her lies or allowing her to completely undermine my credibility with people I was hoping to build business relationships with. Iris solved the problem by calmly suggesting that Grace seemed confused about our relationship status and perhaps needed medical attention, speaking with the kind of professional authority that made Grace's theatrical claims look obviously unstable. The contrast between Iris's calm competence and Grace's desperate dramatics was so stark that most observers quickly figured out who was telling the truth. After Grace finally left, muttering threats about how I'd regret embarrassing her publicly, several potential customers approached to apologize for what they'd witnessed and specifically complimented Iris on her professional handling of what they described as a clearly difficult situation. But the damage was done in terms of my comfort with public exhibitions, and I realized that Grace's behavior was escalating beyond mere surveillance into active sabotage of my attempts to build an independent life. The final straw came when Iris discovered Grace waiting in her apartment building's parking lot at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, sitting in her car with the engine running like some kind of private investigator conducting surveillance. Iris had worked late finishing a manuscript edit and was exhausted when she arrived home to find someone monitoring her building, behavior that crossed every reasonable boundary of post-relationship contact. She called the police immediately, not because she felt physically threatened but because the pattern of stalking had become documented enough to warrant legal intervention. The responding officers were professional and thorough, taking statements about the workplace visits, the art fair confrontation, and the building surveillance while explaining that we had enough evidence for a restraining order if we chose to pursue one. Iris was the one who insisted we follow through with legal action, pointing out that Grace's behavior was escalating rather than improving and that hoping she'd eventually get bored and stop wasn't a realistic strategy. I'd been hesitant to involve the legal system because I still thought of Grace as someone who was just confused and hurt rather than genuinely unstable, but Iris helped me understand that allowing the behavior to continue was actually enabling it to get worse. The restraining order had been in effect for 3 weeks when Grace's parents requested a meeting at my apartment complex, claiming they needed to discuss important family matters that couldn't be handled over the phone. I should have recognized this as a setup, but I'd always had a decent relationship with them and assumed they wanted to discuss practical matters like insurance or shared property that Grace had been too upset to handle directly. They arrived at my building on a Saturday afternoon with Grace in tow, despite the legal documentation specifically prohibiting her from being within 500 feet of my residence. Her mother explained that they'd brought her because she'd been in therapy and had important things she needed to say, as if good intentions could override court orders. Grace looked different than she had during her stalking phase, more composed and less desperate, but there was something rehearsed about her demeanor that suggested this intervention had been carefully planned and practiced. Her father did most of the talking initially, explaining that Grace had been working with a counselor to understand her mistakes and develop better communication skills, while her mother nodded supportively and mentioned how much progress she'd made in recognizing unhealthy patterns. They painted a picture of someone who genuinely transformed through professional help and family support, someone who deserved a second chance to repair the damage she'd caused. Grace herself spoke carefully and deliberately, acknowledging that she'd been possessive and controlling during our marriage, admitting that her surveillance and workplace visits had been inappropriate and frightening for both me and Iris. Her apology sounded genuine and well-structured, covering all the major incidents and taking full responsibility for her choices without making excuses or blaming external factors. She talked about understanding now that her fear of abandonment had caused her to push away the person she most wanted to keep close, and how therapy had helped her recognize that real love meant supporting someone's independence rather than trying to control it. For a moment, I almost believed that this was real growth rather than just a more sophisticated manipulation strategy designed to get around the legal barriers she'd encountered. But then I had to tell them about Iris, about how our relationship had developed from friendship into something serious enough that I was planning to propose, information that I'd kept private until this moment to avoid further escalating Grace's behavior. The change in Grace's expression was immediate and dramatic, like watching someone's face collapse when they realize they've been playing a game with completely different rules than they thought. Her parents looked genuinely shocked, probably assuming that I'd been living alone and pining for their daughter rather than building a completely new life with someone who actually appreciated me. Grace's carefully rehearsed composure cracked as she processed that I wasn't just taking time to cool off before returning to our marriage, but had actually moved on entirely and found someone better suited to what I needed from a partner. Her voice changed as she demanded details about how long I'd been seeing Iris, whether I'd been planning to leave the marriage even before our final fight, and how I could claim to have loved her if I was able to replace her so quickly. The therapy speak disappeared as her real emotions emerged, and I watched her transform back into the entitled, controlling person I'd left rather than the reformed individual her parents had presented. I explained that I'd proposed to Iris the previous weekend during a pottery retreat we'd attended together, presenting her with a ring I'd designed and crafted myself in my workshop, something that represented the life we were building together rather than just an expensive symbol of commitment. Grace's reaction to learning about the engagement was exactly what I'd expected but had hoped to avoid. She tried to enter the building lobby, claiming she had a right to be in the home she'd shared with me, despite the fact that I'd moved to a completely different address months ago. Security footage later showed her pulling on the locked door handles while her parents tried to calm her down, behavior that constituted a clear violation of the restraining order regardless of whether she'd been invited to the property by family members. I called the police from inside my apartment while watching through the window as Grace became increasingly agitated, screaming about how I'd led her on and wasted years of her life while secretly planning to abandon her for someone else. Her parents finally seemed to understand that their daughter's problems were more serious than they'd wanted to acknowledge, especially when the responding officers explained that violating a restraining order was a criminal offense that could result in jail time rather than just a warning or fine. Grace was arrested that evening, spending the night in custody while her parents dealt with the reality that their intervention had backfired spectacularly and probably made their daughter's legal situation significantly worse. The whole incident reinforced my decision to move forward with my life rather than looking backward toward a relationship that had been fundamentally broken long before I'd found the courage to leave it. Her parents called the next day to apologize for bringing Grace to my building and exposing me to what they now realized was ongoing harassment rather than genuine attempts at reconciliation. They seemed to finally understand that Grace needed professional help beyond what family support could provide, and that their attempts to facilitate contact between us had been enabling her obsessive behavior rather than encouraging healthy processing of our relationship's end. I felt genuinely sorry for them as they grappled with seeing their daughter arrested for stalking behavior, but also relieved that the legal system was finally holding Grace accountable for choices that had been escalating unchecked for months. I proposed to Iris during a weekend pottery retreat in the mountains, a 3-day workshop focused on advanced glazing techniques that we'd registered for together as our relationship had deepened beyond casual dating into something that felt genuinely permanent. The retreat center was located in an old converted barn surrounded by pine trees and mountain views, exactly the kind of peaceful setting that encouraged reflection and honest conversation about the future. I'd been planning the proposal for weeks, designing and crafting the ring myself in my workshop using skills I'd developed not just in metalworking but in understanding what Iris actually valued in terms of beauty and craftsmanship. The ring wasn't expensive in terms of market value, but it represented hundreds of hours of careful work and attention to details that mattered specifically to her, the way she preferred subtle elegance over flashy displays, her appreciation for handmade objects that told a story, her belief that the most meaningful gifts were created rather than simply purchased. I waited until Saturday evening when we were sitting outside the workshop building, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the sunset paint the mountains in colors that seemed almost too perfect to be real. The proposal itself was quiet and private, no audience or dramatic gestures, just two people who'd found something worth building together acknowledging that they wanted to make it official and permanent. Iris said yes before I'd even finished explaining why I wanted to spend my life with her, laughing and crying simultaneously as she examined the ring and recognized the craftsmanship that had gone into creating something specifically for her. We spent Sunday morning calling our families and close friends, sharing news that felt genuinely exciting rather than like some kind of social media performance designed to prove our happiness to people we barely knew. Dexter was thrilled and immediately started planning bachelor party activities that involved motorcycles and camping rather than the kind of expensive nightclub events Grace had always insisted were necessary for celebrating major milestones. Iris's parents were welcoming and enthusiastic, asking thoughtful questions about our timeline and offering to help with planning a ceremony that reflected our actual values rather than trying to impress anyone or meet external expectations about what weddings should look like. We decided to hold the ceremony at a local art center that regularly hosted community events, a space that felt connected to our shared interests rather than simply prestigious or photogenic. The planning process was collaborative and stress-free, focused on celebrating our partnership with the people who actually mattered to us rather than creating content for social media or trying to outdo anyone else's celebrations. Iris handled the invitations and catering arrangements while I worked on designing and building furniture pieces that would serve as both decorations and functional items we'd use in our shared home afterward. Everything about the wedding planning reinforced why our relationship worked so well. We made decisions together based on our actual preferences rather than fighting over whose vision would dominate the final result. The guest list was small and deliberate, including family members, close friends, and colleagues who'd supported our relationship rather than people we felt obligated to invite for social or professional reasons. We wrote our own vows, focusing on the specific things we appreciated about each other and the realistic commitments we were making for building a life together, avoiding both religious language that didn't reflect our beliefs and romantic cliches that sounded pretty but didn't mean anything concrete. The ceremony itself was held on a Saturday afternoon in late spring, with handmade decorations that incorporated both pottery pieces we'd created together and wooden elements I'd crafted specifically for the occasion. Iris looked beautiful in a dress she'd chosen because it made her feel like herself rather than trying to conform to bridal magazine standards, and I wore a suit that I'd actually enjoy wearing again for other special occasions rather than something expensive that would hang in my closet afterward. The whole day felt authentic and joyful, celebrating something real rather than performing happiness for an audience or trying to prove anything about our relationship status to people who didn't matter. Grace was nowhere to be seen during the wedding festivities, though Dexter mentioned he'd spotted someone who might have been her sitting alone at the coffee shop 3 blocks from the art center, looking like she was finally beginning to accept that my new life was permanent rather than just a phase designed to make her jealous. The report didn't bother me the way it might have months earlier. By this point, Grace felt like a character from someone else's story rather than a threat to my current happiness, and I was more focused on the celebration than on monitoring whether she was respecting the restraining order. Our wedding night was spent in a local bed and breakfast rather than some expensive resort, talking about the house we'd started looking at and making plans for combining Iris's editing business with my furniture making into a shared workspace that would allow us both to pursue our creative careers from home. The conversation was practical and exciting, 2 people who genuinely liked each other figuring out how to build something sustainable and meaningful together rather than just riding the excitement of a romantic gesture. I realized during that conversation how different this felt from my previous marriage, where our discussions about the future had always felt like negotiations between competing interests rather than collaborative planning between genuine partners. With Iris, sharing resources and making compromises felt natural because we were working toward shared goals rather than trying to convince each other to want different things. 6 months after our wedding, Iris and I opened a small gallery space that combined my furniture pieces with her curated selection of books, creating exactly the kind of business that reflected our shared values and complementary skills. The space was located in a converted warehouse district that was attracting other artists and small business owners, part of a community that appreciated craftsmanship and authentic creativity over mass-produced convenience. I handled the woodworking demonstrations and custom furniture consultations while Iris managed the book selections and reading events, each of us contributing our expertise to something that was genuinely collaborative rather than one person supporting the other's dream. The gallery allowed us to interact with customers who understood the value of handmade objects and carefully chosen books, people who were willing to invest in quality rather than just looking for the cheapest possible option. Our first few months were challenging as we learned how to balance artistic integrity with practical business concerns, but we were solving problems together rather than arguing about whose priorities should take precedence. We bought a house in the same neighborhood as the gallery, a 1920s bungalow with enough space for my workshop in the converted garage and Iris's editing office in what had originally been a sun porch, allowing us both to work from home when we weren't needed at the gallery. The house needed significant work, but I enjoyed the renovation projects and Iris had strong opinions about design elements that made the space feel like ours rather than just a place we happened to live. We spent weekends refinishing hardwood floors, updating the kitchen with custom cabinets I built specifically for the space, and creating a reading nook where Iris could work on manuscripts while I worked on furniture pieces in the adjacent workshop. The process of making the house genuinely ours reinforced how well we functioned as a team, making decisions based on our actual needs and preferences rather than trying to impress visitors or conform to external expectations about how homes should look. Our daily routine settled into something that felt sustainable and fulfilling, built around shared morning coffee before heading to our respective workspaces, collaborative dinners where we discussed the day's challenges and successes, and evening activities that ranged from pottery classes to hiking trails to simply reading in comfortable silence. The contrast with my previous marriage was stark and constant. With Grace, every decision had required negotiation and compromise that left at least one of us feeling frustrated or resentful, while with Iris, most choices felt natural and mutually beneficial. We were building something based on compatibility rather than trying to force incompatible people to function together through sheer willpower and romantic idealism. Grace apparently found stability in her own life, according to mutual friends who mentioned she was dating someone new, a lawyer who seemed better equipped to handle her need for attention and social validation than I'd ever been. The reports suggested she was doing well in therapy and had found someone whose lifestyle and personality were more aligned with what she actually wanted from a relationship. I was genuinely glad to hear she'd found happiness with someone more suitable, both because I wished her well and because it meant she was less likely to resurface in my life with renewed attempts at reconciliation or revenge. The restraining order had expired by this point, but Grace seemed to have moved on completely, focusing on her new relationship rather than trying to interfere with mine. The change reinforced my belief that our marriage had failed because we were fundamentally incompatible rather than because either of us was defective, and that finding the right person made all the difference between constant struggle and natural harmony. My second marriage felt completely different from my first because it was built on daily choice rather than obligation or romantic fantasy, with Iris choosing to be with me because she genuinely enjoyed our life together rather than because she was settling until something better came along. We talked openly about finances, household responsibilities, career goals, and future plans without the emotional landmines that had characterized my previous relationship, addressing problems when they emerged rather than letting resentment build until it exploded into crisis. I realized that healthy relationships required work in the sense of ongoing attention and communication, but they shouldn't feel like constant labor or sacrifice, and that the right partnership actually made individual goals more achievable rather than creating competing demands for time and energy. Looking back, I could see how Grace and I had been trying to force something that was never going to work naturally, while Iris and I had found something that strengthened both of us rather than requiring either of us to become smaller or different to maintain peace.